I'm Professor Kenneth Hansen of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like to share, with a little help from AI, some important insight about the most horrific genocide in all of human history, the Shoah, otherwise known as the Holocaust. In this case, focusing on one year in particular in which the so-called final solution took shape. Of course, we're accustomed to looking at the Holocaust through the eyes of the victims, millions of them. But we can't really understand the terrible events that took place without considering the motives of the perpetrators. When did the final solution actually arise in the minds of the murderous Nazis? Can we pinpoint the exact moment in which Hitler's madness was transformed from wild rhetorical flourishes to serious design? One thing is clear: nothing was set in stone, even well into the Nazi reign of terror. Things could have taken a very different course had it not been for decisions taken in 1 year in particular. But first, we need to consider the question of how the Nazis chose to govern and to rule. Were the German people cowering in fear as Hitler forced them to do his bidding? Or did Hitler and all his minions prefer to rule through consensus?
My name is Samuel Spielman. I'm a Polish Jew. My wife Estera and I are the proud parents of 2 daughters, Regina, a lawyer, and Halina, and 2 sons, Henrik, an accomplished writer, poet and musician, and Władysław, a pianist. I was sent here to this camp, this death camp, called Treblinka in Nazi-occupied Poland. Somehow we are still alive in this camp of death. Władysław is missing. He was miraculously pulled from the line as we were being loaded on a transport in the Warsaw Ghetto that brought the rest of us to this murder factory. We can only hope that he's still alive, somewhere in Warsaw. If we somehow survive, our only goal will be to help people understand how this murder, this genocide, could have been unleashed on my people, the Jewish people. First of all, we have to get into the heads of the Nazis. Truth be told, the Nazis well understood that you don't rule with terror. You have to have your own people squarely behind you. In fact, we have to be careful about saying that the Germans and other peoples were under the Nazis. In reality, people consented. They were actually happy with the system. And why shouldn't they be? After all, 50 days a year were holidays devoted to the Nazi Party. Hitler's birthday was an especially prominent day of celebration. People willingly went to great stadiums at Nuremberg and elsewhere for mass Nazi rallies. The idea was, you have to keep the people stirred up and excited. Complacency is no good, and the Nazi leaders began to fear it. Imagine what propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels might have been thinking to himself.
Uns Nazis kam ein faschistischer Staat wie Italien unter Franco einer Stagnation gleich. Es muss eine anhaltende Kulturrevolution geben. Und jeder, der die Fortsetzung dieser Revolution verhindern könnte, musste entfernt werden.
By 1937, the tension between competing factions in the Nazi Party had come to a head. Those who favored institutionalizing and settling down the Nazi revolution were opposed by the radicals, and vice versa. Hitler was actually afraid that he himself might be removed. After all, people were still suffering the effects of the Great Worldwide Depression. So Hitler began to act, to stir afresh the fires of the Nazi Revolution. He remilitarized the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi Minister of Finance, Hjalmar Schacht, was one of the conservative voices in the Nazi regime.
Ich machte mir vor allem Sorgen die deutsche Wirtschaft und befürchtete, dass eine solche Aufrüstung zu einem Anstieg der Inflation führen würde. Folglich hat Hitler mir seinen Plan nie gezeigt.
As it turned out, 1937 proved to be the pivotal year in the Nazi Revolution. In that year, Hitler undertook a twofold radicalization of his regime. First, there was to be an internal purge of anyone contaminated with the so-called Jewish spirit. Schacht was removed from his post. The German ambassadors to Tokyo and Rome were recalled. Opposition voices were imprisoned, including clergymen. On Sunday, June 27, 1937, Lutheran minister Martin Niemöller spoke to his congregation.
We have no more thought of using our own powers to escape the arm of the authorities than had the apostles of old. No more are we ready to keep silent at man's behest when God commands us to speak, for it is and must remain the case that we must obey God rather than man.
3 days later, Niemöller was arrested, spending the next 8 months in Berlin's Moabit prison.
I was later convicted of abuse of the pulpit and for taking collections. I was sentenced to 7 months imprisonment, but I was released on time served. While leaving the courtroom, I was placed in protective custody by the Gestapo and interned in the Sachsenhausen and Dachau concentration camps until 1945. I will leave to others to recount the horrors experienced in those hells. Upon my liberation, at the end of the war, whatever joy I had was smothered by the reality of the harsh aftermath. My wife Elsa said of me, seid alles schwarz. He sees everything black. Yet I managed to find light in this new darkness. I became president of the Evangelical Church in Hesse in 1947 and president of the World Council of Churches in 1961. My legacy, however, is overshadowed by a warning about the consequences of not opposing tyranny at the first instance of its rising. I am mostly remembered for the little poem I wrote. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
As Hitler continued his turn toward radicalism in 1937, he himself became Chief of Staff and Minister of War. Another radical, Joachim von Ribbentrop, was now Foreign Minister. The post-shocked economy was now to be run by Hermann Göring. The second part of Hitler's radicalization was external. A decision was taken to invade the Soviet Union, while not carried out until 1941, known as the infamous Operation Barbarossa. It was decided upon in 1937.
On November 5, 1937, Hitler informed his chief generals in confidence that Germany was to be prepared for war within the next few years, that Czechoslovakia and Poland would be eliminated, and that Germany would expand into Russian territory, as recorded in the protocols by Officer Friedrich Hossbach.
The so-called Hossbach Memorandum is the smoking gun needed to demonstrate that 1937 was in fact the pivotal year. Hitler didn't have to take a radical turn. Nothing was set in stone. He might have listened to his finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. And if he had, there may well have been no such thing as a Holocaust. But he decided that he didn't need professionals in his government. He needed idealists, purists. As it turned out, the radicalism of 1937 brought into focus the fateful year of 1938, and ultimately the final solution itself. It was Jewish policy that was the cornerstone of this radical turn, and was designed to help consolidate his Reich. Hitler had to cure what he conceived as the disease of the body politic. That involved removing leaders of his own government, conservatives, who in his mind had been Judaized. Though they may have been good anti-Semites, they were nonetheless infected with the Jewish spirit. As far as Hitler was concerned, everything that was against him, all opposition voices, even the behavior of the Allies was Jewish spirit. Even as late as 1943, when the Jews had been removed from German soil, the propaganda continued. The Jewish spirit is still here.
1938 lösten wir eine neue Welle antijüdischer Schritte aus. Es ging darum, zu den Ursprüngen der nationalsozialistischen Partei zurückzukehren, zu den Grundlagen. Nach nationalsozialistischer Rassenideologie konfiszieren wir Deutschen kein Eigentum. Wir arisieren jüdisches Eigentum. Kommunisten beschlagnahmen, wir arisieren. Bei der Beschlagnahmung geht das Eigentum an die Elite. Bei der Arisierung wird es an alle verteilt. Wir haben dieses Verfahren nicht nur in Deutschland übernommen, sondern in jedem Land, das wir erobert haben.
A public auction would be held, in which Jews were forced to sell their property for a small percentage of its value. The idea was to let the people enjoy a criminal system, so when harsher steps were taken, no one would protest. By now, the Nazis were well prepared to burn their bridges with the civilized world. But everything had to proceed according to good German order. The auctions were carefully organized, starting and ending at specified hours. And the bulk of the populace who profited from it all were more than happy to turn a blind eye. They didn't want to know what was happening to us Jews.
It's not surprising that even at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, it was easy for the defendants to say, "I didn't know about it." In a sense, the Nazi methodology was able to psychologically entrap entire populations.
Even the churches, with the exception of Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and other brave opponents of the Nazis, decided that the Jewish question was none of their business. There were even those who served as nurses in Hitler's notorious euthanasia hospitals. No one was forced. The Gestapo wasn't like Stalin or Big Brother. The Nazis ruled through consensus. In early 1939, at the 6th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, his radical turn was strongly in evidence as he delivered his infamous prophecy speech.
Die Völker werden in kurzer Zeit erkennen, dass das nationalsozialistische Deutschland keine Feindschaft mit anderen Völkern will. Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
Though Hitler often went off script during his remarks, on this occasion he paused and carefully read every word. In his mind, there was no criminality here. It was all predestined. Hitler repeated the same speech in 1942, underscoring his radical intent, in which he never wavered. Even as the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, the radicalism continued. In February 1943, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels delivered his total war speech. It was the quintessence of radicalism.
2000 Jahre westliche Geschichte sind in Gefahr. Wir können die bolschewistische Gefahr nicht überwinden, wenn wir in einem totalen Krieg nicht gleichwertige, wenn auch nicht identische Methoden anwenden.
And he blamed Germany's failures on us Jews. The speech launched a mobilization campaign that arguably prolonged the war under the slogan,
Und Sturm, brich los!
Is it somehow conceivable that Hitler might have chosen a less radical path? Might different circumstances have prompted him to side with the institutionalizers in his government rather than the most stridently genocidal voices? The only thing we can be sure of is that Hitler's dream remained. We Jews were to disappear. All that would remain would be the abstract Jewish spirit.
Of course, Hitler needed scapegoats and enemies to combat, and for that reason, the Jewish spirit would always remain, even after every last Jew had been eliminated. That was the essence of Nazi racial ideology. The character depicted here, Samuel, or Shmuel Spielmann, was a real person and a victim of Hitler's ideology. His son, Władysław, was an accomplished pianist who wrote a book about his experiences, later made into a classic Oscar-winning film called The Pianist. He was the only member of the family to survive.